A little more than a year ago, I applied for and got a job at my favorite convenience store across the street from my house. I'd moved there my sophomore year in college and decided to stay after I left school. This little store has served as a savior to me. Living as young men often do, I had very little money, but I was always confident I could find something to fill my belly regardless of how much was in my pocket at the time. So when the time came, I was no longer able to rely on my parents for money. The corner store was the first place I went for a job. I was in luck. Only the day before one of the employees was fired for stealing from the register. And I took his place, and I've been here ever since. Like any other corner store, we sell alcohol, beer, wine, liquor, the whole boat. Naturally, this makes us a beacon for the local drunks. These folks have served as countless hours of entertainment. While most are harmless people, on one specific occasion, a horribly violent outburst occurred. It was a quiet Saturday night about an hour before close. Most of the regulars had made their appearances a few more than once. The two involved in this instance had been in around 7 p.m. and had just returned. They were, or at least appear to be, a couple. I'd seen them around the neighborhood since I moved in. The owner of the store said they'd been customers since he bought the store. And that was 13 years ago. Although they were not very talkative when they came in, I never had any reason to believe either could be violent. However, and then nights something had changed. Upon arriving the second time, they went straight to the cooler containing the quarts and 40 outsized beers. Nothing out of the ordinary, as I said, but tonight, an argument between the two started soon after their arrival. Initially, I couldn't hear what it was about. But soon I could hear everything they said across the store. I minded my own business for a while, but once the female began screaming curse words at the man, I felt like I had to at least get them to take it outside. I wasn't sure what to say. But I began my walk to the opposite side of the small store. Before I was halfway there, the man started screaming back at the woman. I'm not sure exactly what she had said to him, but it had obviously infuriated him. Mere moments before, he had taken a quart bottle of Busch or some other cheap beer from the cooler. All of a sudden, he began striking down at the woman's head with it. I'm not sure if he thought it would break or if he intended on hurting her with the nearest thing, but strike after strike. He continued. It was a horrifying thing to witness. I blamed the entertainment industry for giving people the false impression of how easy it is to break a beer bottle over someone's head. I assure you it's very hard. Following the fifth or sixth strike, the woman had dropped completely to the floor and stopped moving. The guy stood over her for a moment, but looked up when I assumed he heard me running towards him. The second he saw me, he ran out the side door and disappeared into the darkness. The sight of her laying there made me sick to my stomach. The blood dripping from her ears was almost as shocking as the ever-growing pool around her head. It seemed like a bad idea to touch her, so I made the decision to let the paramedics check her for a pulse. When they arrived, she was still alive, but they didn't have much hope for her survival. The cops certainly weren't in any hurry to get there. But when they did finally arrive 45 minutes later, I filled them in on all I had seen. From the way they reacted, I got a strong feeling that they were very familiar with the two. While on shifts a few days later, my boss called with some news. The female was brain dead, and her family had made the choice to let her pass the cops to pick the guy up the following night. From the description my boss gave me, he didn't even seem to remember what had happened. The doctors that examined him said that it's likely he truly may not remember what he did, because of the many years of alcohol abuse had possibly destroyed his brain. Sounds like he might not get the full punishment due to him under the law. I'm not really sure how I feel about that. Sometimes, it seems like people really do get away with murder. I serve as one of 2 managers for our local branch of a national convenience store chain. Starting as a wide-eyed 23-year-old girl, I worked my way up to night manager within 5 years. Not a groundbreaking achievement, I admit, but an achievement nonetheless. My job includes staying late after closing to count the night's drawers and drop the deposits for the day manager to put in the bank. I've never minded much having to do this job. The past 5 years working here's been on the night shift, and nothing really scary has ever happened while I was on the clock. The only holdup in the history of the store occurred during the day. Therefore, I've never had any reason to fear working after dark. That was until just recently when I became the subject of someone's obsession. Talking about this in the first place is very embarrassing for me. I feel like when people hear about this, they think I am bragging about my looks, but I swear I'm not. I recognize that I'm an average-looking woman. But that's as far as my vanity goes. I would have probably kept this incident to myself, but my therapist feels that sharing my experience will help other women as well as myself. So that's why we're here. Hopefully he's right and this horrible ordeal really can serve to help other women who have suffered from the same form of negative attention. Now that I put this off for so long, I guess it's time to tell you exactly what it is that happened. As I said, I work the night shift 6 days a week. The number of weirdos I encounter is somewhat high. A fight once or twice a year. Homeless drunks, the usual lot for a clerk and a convenience store in America. In spite of the craziness going on around me day to day, I had managed to go unnoticed by any of those weirdos until around 6 months ago. About that time this particular man began coming to the store. Initially, it was only once or twice a week, and when he did, nothing was said to me. However, as time passed, his visits became more and more frequent. This in itself isn't that odd. Anybody who's worked in a convenience store for a length of time can tell you regulars go with the territory. Some you will see every day at the same time, some more than once. So at the time, I had no need to be concerned. A month into this routine, I noticed that he would wait until I had no customers so I could bring him up. What made it so obvious was his concerted effort to start a discussion with me about that weather, small talk like that. Although I found it funny, then I didn't realize I was encouraging him by engaging in these discussions with him. Soon the talks became more personal, most banal discussions. The first time I was asked to find a boyfriend, I laughed it off. But the third and fourth were the first indication to me that I may have a problem on my hands. My suspicions were cemented the day he asked me out. Perhaps from instinct, I said no, but I was careful to be kind in the way I said it. At that moment, he seemed to take it well. However, another clerk told me later that evening that he was actually very angry. I guess I never really learned to read a guy's body language. The next time he came in, he didn't talk to me and didn't return to normal until a few days later, when he acted like nothing had ever happened. I had gotten the impression he had decided to let it go. But just one day later, he asked me to go out with him again. This time he said he meant it just spreads. As before, I declined. He made an effort to hide his anger this time, and the expression on his face as he stood there really frightened me. The week following the second instance, I spent most of my time hiding out in the office, doing paperwork. The male clerk he had befriended told me he had asked about me, but the clerk only told him I was out. I took advantage of this friendship to ask the clerk to talk to the man, and wanting them to ask the guy did not come into the store when I was working anymore. His most recent behavior, it scared me. The discussion must have happened because I didn't see him for several days. Curious as to what was said, I asked the clerk what reaction the man had. He only answered by saying that the guy had severe anger problems and I should probably watch my back. I'm not sure if the clerk thought that would make me feel better. But obviously it made me far more scared. He stayed away from the store during my shifts, and I didn't see him for a few weeks. One day during shift change, I was talking to the day manager, and he mentioned a discussion that he had had with my stalker, as he called him. The manager had made the remark in passing that he didn't normally see him that time of the day. The guy told him he had stopped coming in on my shift because I thought it was too good for him. The manager said as he spoke, his eyes blazed with anger. I certainly dodged the bullet. At least that's what I thought then. In the coming weeks, I would catch glimpses of him walking through the parking lot. Sometimes he would stand at the edge of the lot, just outside the glare of the lamp, and watch me. The last time I caught him doing this, I called the cops. When they arrived, I explained the situation to them, but as you can imagine, they told me they couldn't do anything unless he blatantly threatened me. Of course, by the time they arrived, he was gone. I'm not sure if me calling the cops scared him or not, but I didn't see him for a while. Our last meeting was less than an hour after close about a month ago. I just finished the deposits and was preparing to leave the store. As I walked out of the office heading to the door, I noticed the shadow of a man standing and of the glare of the lamp. Just as my stalker had done, terrified, I called the cops right away. There was no way I was going to leave the store alone at 12:50 a.m. with him standing outside. They showed up in less than 5 minutes, but naturally, he had already left. I got the usual speech, but they were at least kind enough to volunteer to come around for the next week or two at closing and hang around until I could lock up and drive away. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I heard the news. While I was engaging in work talk with the mail clerk, he mentioned that my stalker had ended his own life the week before. I didn't believe him. So we went into the office, and he brought the man's obituary up on the computer. Shocked would be an understatement. And knew I hadn't seen him, but I assumed the police presence at close had scared him off. It took me a few minutes to gather myself. I wasn't sure how to feel about this. While he had clearly become a danger to me, I couldn't help but feel bad for him. He obviously had a major anger issue, but I had no idea how bad his life had been outside the store. I've always thought it was important to try and be empathetic towards others. On the other hand, the relief I felt and still feel often overrides any feelings of sadness or guilt I may have. I can only hope that he has found as much peace in taking his life as I have. God, I know that sounds terrible. But honestly, can you blame me? Rest in peace, Robert. I do truly hope you have found the peace you so sorely needed. Recently, a terrible event occurred at the gas station my family owns. And considering the fact the victim was somebody close to the family, I thought this would be the best way for him to be remembered. However, the only way my dad would allow me to share this story is on the condition I didn't use the people's real names. So anybody interested in looking online for more information surrounding this crime will be disappointed because I'll have to change all the names. I guess I should start by giving you all some info on my family and our store. My dad bought it in 1996, a few years after his wife and he divorced. A few years later, he ran to her mom at the store. They had dated in high school, and she had just moved back after her husband died. They dated for a couple of months and then decided to get married. By March of 2000, my mom was pregnant with my sister and then me about 2 years after most of our life has taken place in and around the store. My sister and I both learned to walk there, and many, if not all of our babysitters were women that worked there. My dad always said that the store itself was part of the family. And that includes everybody who works there. If that's true, Steve should have been the godfather of the family. He'd already been working at the store 10 years before Dad bought it. And he was the one that taught him how the place ran best. They became fast friends, and since he had no living family, he spent every holiday with us. Heck, they even hunted together. That's the reason his death and a holdup hit us so hard. The day after it happened, a call from the cops came into the store asking for the surveillance footage of the robbery. It didn't seem right for Dad or Amy and my sister to compile it. So I volunteered. I'll surely never volunteer for anything ever again. Going into this knowing what would happen made it harder, but I knew the others definitely couldn't handle it. I only knew the basics of the shooting. So as I watched the guy enter and approach the counter, a sick feeling rose in my gut. My instinct was to yell at the screen in a vain effort to warn Steve, but the stupidity of doing that stopped me. For the first minute they stood and talked. I couldn't hear about what because the camera had no audio. I was caught off guard when he pulled out the gun. It was so fast. Even without the sound, Steve's fear was playing. He did his best to keep the robber calm. And he was until Steve handed him the money from the register. The robber had chosen the time right before closing to come in. Unfortunately for him, Steve had just dropped most of the cash in a few minutes before, and once he was handed was no more than a $20 bill, a 5 and 5 once. He must have expected more. He began screaming and Steve tried to calm him down. He must have known somehow what was about to happen. His expression was of downright horror. Right before the shot came, he said something to the rubber. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. But after rewinding the video a few times, I could kind of read his lips say, "Oh God, please don't do it. You don't have to." Those were his last words. 5 gunshots later his life was over. The video ended with the shooter running out of the store. No one shows up on the screen again until about 1:17 a.m. when the officer stopped to see why the store was still open. He was the one who found Steve's body. When I was positive I had what they needed. I checked to make sure the clip had recorded to the thumb drive, confident, and had I removed it and dropped it into a manila envelope and sealed it up. The teardrop hitting the envelope was the first hint to me that I'd been crying. I hadn't realized how important a part Steve played in my life. Just to make sure no one would bumble onto it, I locked the envelope in my desk drawer and called them to pick it up. I thought it may comfort you to know that the police know who the shooter is. It sounds like the guy couldn't stop complaining about how little we got and somebody snitched them out. They haven't arrested him yet, but it's only a matter of time. The video shows his face clearly. I'm sure that will be enough to hang him. And that's exactly what I hope they do to him. I know his execution won't bring Steve back. But the thought of that SOB dying, sure, feels good. Just the other night, my aunt and I were drinking some beers around the fire pit in my backyard when she told me a story I'd never heard her mention before. I'm not a very good writer, and the way she told it had me glued to my seat. Because of that, I asked her to write it down so I could post it. She was a little nervous about the idea at first, but as soon as I convinced her that she could write it in a way to remain anonymous, she agreed. I do warn everyone reading this that the subject matter is very upsetting and may trigger those who have been victims of violence in the past. You've been warned. From this point on, the rest of what's written will be by my aunt, so prepare yourselves. It was sometime in the middle 1980s, and I was living in the Midwest with a friend back home. We had been bouncing from temp job to temp job for the past 5 years or so. Then late one night, we stopped into the liquor store to pick up some booze. Neither of us had jobs at the time, and she appeared to notice a help wanted sign in the front window. The following day, she returned and asked about the job. By the end of the day she had been hired. She'd always had a way about her, a way to put people at ease. It was the greatest character trait about her. And I don't believe she ever had an enemy in her life. Anyhow, while I continued my search for permanent employment, she was enjoying her job and making a lot of friends to boot. She would often invite her co-workers over to our apartment after work to party, and we always had an awesome time. They were really good people. I even dated one of the guys she worked with, but it didn't work out. Then, just as life was starting to get good for us all, a horrible crime occurred and I would lose my best friend forever. The night of my roommate was doing her closing duties, and most of the staff had met up at the store to head over to our place together. Sometime just before she locked the doors, 2 guys came in and walked around the store. She waited for several minutes at the register before she reminded them that the store was closing. This is when the men pulled their guns, 100 of the staff together, into the walk-in cooler while the other locked the door and switched off the sign. Once they were back together, the leader, the guy who would let everyone into the cooler, assured them no one would be harmed. As long as somebody opened the safe for them, they take their money and leave. Nobody spoke until the door guy pistol whipped one of the girls across the head. The roommate quickly told them that the only person that had the key to the safe was the day manager, and he wasn't there. This wasn't true. He was at the back of the group comforting his girlfriend that just got hit. Still, no one to this day understands why she lied. She often said that if she was robbed, she wasn't about to die for somebody else's money. The two robbers were beginning to get irritated. So my roommate mentioned that the money was still in the register. It was only around $30, but it was something the two men ignored her. But the door guy walked out of the cooler and came back a few minutes later. They walked her way a couple of steps and talked about what no one knows. When they returned to the group, the leader was visibly angry. He repeated what he said earlier, but this time no one said anything back. Here's where it all went to chaos. The leader's frustration boiled over. He took one step forward towards the group and kicked the young man in front of him. Then, he opened fire on the whole group. For a solid minute, he and his accomplices emptied their guns into the victims. And the only survivor, who just happened to be the day manager, said he was hit at least 4 times before they moved on to the next person. Even though he had tried to cover his girlfriend with his body, she was still hit multiple times herself. He lost consciousness soon after the shot stopped, so no one knows exactly when the shooter is left. What is known for sure is the 5 innocent people lost their lives for $32.53. It was almost 9 hours before they were found. By then, anyone who could have been saved except one had died. His stay in the hospital lasted 2 weeks, and the month after that was spent in physical therapy, learning how to use his right arm again. The last time I spoke to him, which was sometime in 1997, he was still seeing a psychologist twice a month. As far as I know, only one of the shooters was ever arrested, the door guy, and that was for another crime. He was connected to this crime while serving time in prison. He did eventually cop to it, but will never give up his partner. He would only say that he had lost his life while committing another robbery. Nobody involved in solving the case believed him. But until they found the clue connecting them to a name, the case is still at a standstill. If he asked me who was the most affected, I would probably say it was the day manager, Ben. Not only had my roommate lied to protect him, we assumed his attempt to save the girl he loved failed, and he spent on nights laying next to her while she and 4 other of his friends slowly bled to death. I'd say in comparison, I've gotten off easy. Don't get me wrong. Many of those people were my friends too. One of them the best friend I've ever had. And the week doesn't go by that I don't think about all of them. However, when it comes to Ben, I don't think life will ever be the same again. Until last week, I worked a dead-end job at a gas station across town. This is why I quit and the crazy week that led up to it. About 2 weeks ago, my old man came into my room, woke me up, and started complaining about how he was lazy and needed to get a job. Typical. I didn't really have anything to say. Of course, he got even madder because of this. He then informed me that he had asked his friend to give me a job at his gas station. I would have appreciated if he would have asked me first, but he didn't. My first shift started in the few hours when they haul, so after a super quick shower, I began my first day of work. I could tell the job was going to suck from the start. My dad's friend was an idiot and most of the employees were too. One girl thought she was Nicki Minaj. The whole time she was working she was rapping or singing some R&B song. For some reason, the king douche put her with me for every shift and I had to listen to her terrible music. On the rare occasion she wasn't singing or rapping. She was talking about her baby daddy. As you can imagine, most of the time I was working. I wanted to get a box full of Tide Pods and chase it with a jug of bleach. If you thought it couldn't get worse, you're wrong. When the owner wasn't around, her friends hung out at the store and did so for hours. I don't mean 2 or 3 people either, I mean upwards of 20 or more. That would park the cars in the front of the store where the customer should have been and play their stereos at astronomical levels. And the bass got so bad it would shake the window sometimes. It was my perfect idea of literal torture. I got to the point that I was having nightmares that I was trapped inside a rap video. And believe it or not, a gunfight broke out at the store while we were working 2 nights ago. The story as it was told to me was that one of my co-workers' friends had a beef with a gang member in another neighborhood. This beef had started as something tame but quickly escalated to violence. My co-worker's friend had gotten into a fight with the gang member's cousin and must have messed him up pretty bad because the member's cousin ended up in the hospital for several days. Because of this, the cousin swore that he was going to fill the guy full of holes. A normal person would have laid low for a while if someone told him a gangster was gunning for him. But none of my co-worker's friends could be called anything near normal. So he continued to acting as if nothing was wrong until the gang member spotted him loafing around and drinking booze in our parking lot. The shooting part of this nightmare didn't last long. But by the time it was through, 2 of my co-worker's friends were dead, and 3 other innocent bystanders were injured. The guy who was the intended target of the attack was unscathed. 2 of her female friends were the people who lost their lives. One of the girls was begging the paramedics to not let her die as they rushed her away. The 3 bystanders injured had nothing to do with the foolishness. Luckily for them, they got off with very minor injuries. The worst of the 3 just happened to be myself. I received 1 graze to my knee and 1 direct hit my shin. My God, did that hurt. My first call upon waking up today was to the store owner to let him know I was quitting. He sounded like he had been expecting it. As far as I know, the cut-rate Nicki Minaj was still working there, despite the fact her presence caused the entire mess. The shooting wasn't the whole reason I quit. Looking at it, not offering to pay my medical bills was the big reason. My dad didn't even say anything about this, even though the guy was supposed to be his friend. I haven't told him yet. But I'm sure his friend will call sometime today and tell him I don't care if he gets mad or not. That job could never pay enough to make it worth getting shot. I'd rather work in the sewers and put up with all that stuff I've had to deal with for the past 2 weeks. And here I am in the hospital. If that job means so much to him, he can go work there with his tightwad buddy in the dollar store Nicki Minaj while they wait to get shot. I've had enough now for me, and I'll be here recovering. Brian was always a little different than the other kids we grew up with. These days, I imagine some teacher would have labeled him as having autism and drugged the uniqueness out of him. I want to make it clear from the start that he wasn't mentally disabled. It was the exact opposite. In fact, he was so smart that he acquired the nickname Brain in middle school. His intelligence made him popular and a very good student. He even got to graduate a whole year early because he was so smart. College was more the same until his junior year when he began to have problems. He started skipping classes and disappearing for days at a time. When we discovered he was hearing voices, my dad flew into town and took him to a doctor. It took a few, but eventually the diagnosis of schizophrenia was made and he was put on medication. Even with medication, it was obvious he wasn't going to make it in school. So he moved back home soon after. His first year back was a series of ups and downs while the doctors tried to find a medication that would work long term. He'd start a drug, do well for a few weeks, and then go back to disappearing. We found out that on one of his vacations that he had begun getting high on street drugs to suppress the symptoms. To our relief, just after the new year, they finally found a medicine that worked. Things drastically improved after that. A program was started that was partnered with the county to help those with mental illnesses find employment. Brian signed up for it, and a month later, he got a job at a convenience store down the street. This proved to be a blessing and a curse. Now that he was doing well and working, his life was back on track after 2 long years. He loved the job and was happy to be back providing for himself. We were all finally able to move forward and live a semblance of a normal life. And this is the way it stayed for the next 2.5 years. Then the store closed. Losing his job sent Brian back into his old habits of sleeping on the streets and drug abuse. When he was off his meds, he was a completely different man. When I didn't recognize he will be gone a few days, come back and restart his medicine and start to do well. But then, with no reason, disappear again for another week. Then one day, just like that, he never came back. He had been missing over a week at the point we started to worry. He'd always come home before, so we gave him 3 more days before we started looking for him. We spent several more driving around town, going to his usual haunts. But no one had seen him for over a week. At this point, we began to panic. So we did what we should have done in the first place and went to the police. Since he was an adult with a history of psychological troubles and we had no proof he had been taken against his will, all we could do was file a report. The cop said that they would keep an eye out for him. But that was the best that they could do. At that point, the only option we had left was to go home and hope Brian showed up. The longer time went by, the more worried I became. Dad didn't indicate anything above the understandable level of concern. At least he didn't show it. Mom was probably the worst. She said more than once that she had a bad feeling and she didn't handle it very well. I had no reason to be worried. But every day he stayed gone made me more anxious. Regardless of how I felt inside, I kept my feelings to myself and maintained a mask of optimism. After a year with no word, I determined that Tim returning was up to him. I had no control over his life, and letting the possibilities eat me up from the inside was getting me nowhere. When he came back, we would all welcome him with open arms. We did the best that we could get on with living debt, and I managed to pull it off relatively well. But Mom didn't. When the doctors discovered the cancer in her breast, Brian had been gone about 5 years. I believe her worrying about him 24 hours a day fed it, maybe even caused it in the first place. Combined with her total disregard for treatment, no matter how we begged, she was dead in less than 6 months. Now that it was just Dad and I, we were forced to pick up the pieces and move on again, or let it kill us till life carried on. Nothing really changed until 2 years later, when we finally received the call that we'd been waiting for. But the news that we got was not what we expected. Earlier in the month, the family had purchased the old convenience store. They had hired a cleaning company to go into the place and clean up the mess left after almost 8 years of sitting closed. One morning the crew was in the storage room, picking up the leftovers of a ceiling collapse, and made a terrible discovery. The body of what was believed to be a man was buried under the pile of ceiling tiles and insulation. The police had no idea who it could be. And there were no visible marks in the body to indicate the cause of death. Ultimately, at the end of a 3-week investigation, including the autopsy and DNA tests, it was determined that the body in the back room was Brian. They still haven't arrived at a concrete answer of how he died. But drug paraphernalia was found near him. The strongest theory, his overdose, whether on purpose or not, will never be known. So there we were. Over 7 years after we lost him. Dad and I were burying him next to Mom and the family plot. The day was a hard one. But knowing where Brian was after all this time took away a bit of the sting. We only wish Mom would have survived to see it. It turned out she was right all along. Brian had been dead the whole time, but was just a few blocks down the road. In the one place he had left that gave him joy and helped him to feel normal again. Knowing that made me smile. I look forward to this day every year. The opportunity to remember Brian and his far too short life is one of the few things left that makes me smile. Hopefully, that will be back from his work next year and we can celebrate together again. It may be my last chance to do so. The disgusting disease that took my mom has apparently picked me to be its next victim. If Dad's still working, and I've moved on next year, do me a favor and share the story again. Brian was a beautiful man. And despite his troubles, he was loved by all those he met, and at least, he should always be remembered for that.